Imagine being a child taken from your family and told to forget your language, stories, and even the taste of home. The story of Native American boarding schools isn't just in history books. It's written on the dinner plates of the children who lived there. Meals like cornmeal mush and salt pork were meant to fill stomachs, not nurture culture. Starting in the late 1800s, U.S. government and church-run schools replaced traditional native foods with rations like fried cornbread squares and bean and cabbage chowder, using food to break cultural ties. These 25 meals tell a story of hunger, survival, and quiet resistance, proof that even in hardship, memory and identity endured and still shape native food traditions today. 1. Cornmeal mush with molasses drizzle. Every boarding school child remembers the cornmeal mush. It wasn't soft cornbread or roasted kernels like they knew at home. It was a stiff yellow block boiled until bland, dropped onto plates morning after morning. If you were lucky, a thin drizzle of molasses cut through the dryness. Administrators loved it because it was cheap. For the kids, it meant chewing something that felt more like glue than food. Some swallowed it quick, others held their breath, imagining wild rice or corn soup instead. The irony? Corn was sacred in so many native traditions, symbol of life and spirit. Here it was stripped of meaning, reduced to tasteless survival. Yet even in that bitter mush, kids carved small escapes. That trickle of molasses became a moment to pretend they were back home, with family, with flavor. A week of mush in today's dollars might cost less than $10, but the real cost was memory, culture, and hunger. 2. Salt pork and potato stew with hard bread. If cornmeal mush was monotony, salt pork stew was misery in a bowl. Picture a watery pot with floating potato chunks, their edges gray from overboiling. Here and there, you'd find a fatty cube of salt pork, more gristle than meat, swimming in the grease. It was supposed to be hearty, but most kids left the table still hungry. Beside it sat a piece of hard bread, baked days before, so tough it scraped the roof of your mouth. Teachers claimed it built discipline. For the children, it built blisters and cracked teeth. Still, they chewed, because hunger didn't care about pain. Back home, pork and potatoes could have been roasted with onions, shared with laughter around the fire. In the schools, the same ingredients became punishment food, stripped of flavor, stripped of meaning. A week's worth of this stew today would barely cost $15. Cheap calories, sure. But for native kids, every spoonful was a reminder that survival always came second to control. 3. Cabbage and beef bone soup with barley. This was the kind of soup that smelled more sour than savory. A huge pot of boiled cabbage, a beef bone tossed in for show, and a handful of barley to thicken the water. That was dinner. The bone rarely had meat left on it, just marrow flavor that clung to the broth. Kids dug through the cabbage leaves hoping for something more, but most bowls were just limp greens and cloudy water. Barley, meant to stretch the meal, often sank to the bottom, half-cooked and chewy. Teachers called it nutritious, but it was thin fuel for children doing hours of labor in the fields or workshops. Back home, cabbage and beef might have been part of a feast, slow-cooked with seasoning, shared with pride. At school, it became another reminder of how little they were worth. In today's dollars, a pot of this soup might cost under $12 to feed dozens. Cheap, yes, but its taste carried the heavy price of hunger and loss. 4. Stewed dried apples with biscuits. Once in a while, the boarding school tables offered something sweet, stewed dried apples. But don't picture a warm pie or spiced compote. These apples were leathery slices boiled down until mushy, sometimes tart, sometimes bitter, depending on how long they'd sat in storage. Sugar, if added at all, was scarce. Beside them came hard biscuits, baked in bulk and left to toughen on the shelves. Kids dunked the biscuits into the apple stew just to soften them enough to chew. The pairing looked like a treat on paper, but in reality it was another cheap way to quiet growling stomachs. Back home, apples might have been roasted by the fire or baked into bread. Here, the fruit became a symbol of deprivation. Sweetness dulled, joy flattened. A week's worth of apples and biscuits today would cost maybe $14. But for the children who ate them, the taste lingered not as dessert, but as another reminder of what was taken away. 5. Wheat bread with lard spread and weak coffee. Breakfast at many boarding schools looked simple. A thick slice of wheat bread, smeared with lard instead of butter, and a tin cup of weak coffee. The bread was coarse and dry, baked in bulk, sometimes stale before it even hit the table. The lard spread, greasy and flavorless, sat heavy in the mouth, coating more than it satisfied. The coffee, if you could call it that, was brown water with the faintest bitter edge, brewed weak to stretch the beans. Children too young for coffee still got it, because milk was too costly. It was fuel, not comfort, meant to push them through long days of chores and lessons. For many kids, this breakfast was a daily reminder. Food wasn't about joy here, it was about obedience. Back home, mornings might have meant fresh bread, berries, or hearty corn soup. In the schools, it was lard and bitterness. Cost in today's money? Maybe $10 a week per child. But the real debt was cultural hunger that no slice of bread could fill. 6. Boiled navy beans with salt pork bits. Navy beans were a boarding school staple, cheap, filling, and endlessly recycled. Pots of them simmered for hours until the beans split open, their skins slipping off into the cloudy broth. If you were lucky, you might find a small cube of salt pork floating in the pot, more fat than meat, but enough to give the beans a salty tang. For children, the meal was predictable. Scoop after scoop of mushy beans that stuck to their teeth and sat heavy in their stomachs. Teachers praised it as nutritious, but most kids knew it was just another way to stretch pennies. Back home, beans could be stewed with venison, corn, or herbs, flavors layered with care. At school, the beans were stripped of that love, boiled plain, their sameness turning every dinner into a reminder of loss. In 2025 terms, a week's supply of navy beans and scraps of pork might cost just $9. Cheap food, yes. But for native children, it carried the bitter taste of hunger disguised as nourishment. 7. Oatmeal porridge with powdered milk. Morning often meant a metal bowl of oatmeal porridge, steaming but bland. The oats were boiled until gummy, more paste than grain, and sweeteners were rare. Instead of fresh milk, powdered milk was whisked into the pot, thin, chalky, with a taste that clung to the tongue. Children ate it quickly, not because it was good, but because it was hot and at least filled the belly. Teachers insisted it was healthy fuel for the long day ahead, though most kids knew it was just another way to stretch rations. Back in their homes, oats might have been mixed with berries, maple, or even wild nuts, turning the same grain into something comforting. At school, the porridge was stripped of joy, leaving only a memory of what it could have been. A week's worth in today's money? Maybe $8? Cheap and easy, yes, but for the children forced to eat it, oatmeal tasted more like control than care. 8. Boiled turnips and potatoes with gravy. Dinner trays at boarding schools often carried the same sight, pale chunks of boiled turnips and potatoes swimming in a thin brown gravy. The vegetables were overcooked until they collapsed under a fork, their sharp flavors turning bitter or watery. The gravy, more liquid than sauce, was poured on top to disguise the blandness, but it never quite worked. For children used to roasted roots cooked slowly at home with herbs or meat, this meal felt like an insult. Potatoes and turnips, once symbols of winter survival and family hearths, became lifeless reminders of institutional rations. Still, kids forced it down because hunger didn't leave much choice. The schools called it wholesome, but the truth was clear. It was cheap, easy to make in vats, and filling enough to quiet growling stomachs. In today's dollars, feeding dozens on turnips, potatoes, and a bit of flour-thickened gravy might cost less than $12 a week. But the real price was the taste of dignity boiled away. 9. Split pea soup with scraps of ham. Split pea soup was one of the boarding school's specialties, big kettles of green mush simmered all day, thick but flavorless, made from dried peas bought in bulk. If you were lucky, you'd find a shred of ham or a bit of bone floating in your bowl, but more often the promise of meat was just that, a promise. Kids ate it because it was warm and filling, not because it tasted good. The texture was pasty, the flavor salty and dull. Teachers liked to call it hearty, but the children knew it was just another way to stretch pennies. At home, peas might have been stewed with venison or seasoned with herbs, turning a humble dish into comfort food. Here, it was just survival. And for children missing their families, that bowl of soup became a daily reminder that tradition had been traded for control. In today's dollars, a week of pea soup with scraps of ham might cost under $10. Cheap fuel, yet it left kids hungrier for what money couldn't buy: care and culture. 10. Fried cornbread squares with sorghum syrup. Every so often, boarding school meals looked almost inviting, like fried cornbread squares. Golden on the outside but dense within, they were fried in lard until crisp and handed out in thick chunks. To make it seem like a treat, a thin pour of sorghum syrup was drizzled on top. For a moment, children could close their eyes and pretend. Back home, cornbread was sacred, soft, fragrant, eaten with beans or stews, carrying the warmth of family kitchens. But here, fried squares were mass-produced, heavy and oily. The sorghum syrup, though sweet, was stretched so thin that most bites tasted of grease more than sugar. Still, kids ate them eagerly, clinging to any hint of sweetness. That drizzle of syrup became the closest thing to dessert most would ever see inside those walls. In 2025 terms, a week's worth of cornbread and sorghum would cost about $11. Cheap and filling, yes, but for native children, it was a reminder of how even comfort food was flattened into control. 11. Stewed cabbage and carrots with margarine. On many nights, supper was nothing more than stewed cabbage and carrots. The vegetables were boiled until limp, their colors fading into a pale, watery mix. A spoonful of margarine, cheap and greasy, was dropped on top to make it edible. Instead of richness, it left a slick film on the tongue. Children picked through their bowls, searching for flavor that wasn't there. The smell was sharp, the taste bitter, and the texture soggy. Yet, this was considered nutritious enough to keep them working through long days of labor. Back in their homes, cabbage and carrots could have been roasted over fire, paired with meat, or brightened with herbs. At school, they were stripped of care, served as bulk rations to fill bellies, not hearts. In today's dollars, a week of cabbage, carrots, and margarine might run just $9. But the real cost was the way it turned living food into lifeless fuel. 12. Rice pudding with raisins and sugar syrup. Rice pudding was one of the few meals that looked like dessert, but even here, disappointment lingered. The rice was overcooked until mushy, stirred with watered-down milk, and thickened with sugar syrup. Every now and then, a raisin floated to the surface, rare little treasures in an otherwise bland bowl. Children ate it quickly, chasing those raisins like prizes, but most spoonfuls tasted flat and starchy. Teachers saw it as a treat, yet for the kids it was just another way to dress up cheap rations. Sweet, yes, but thin sweetness that only highlighted what was missing. Back home, rice wasn't common for many tribes, but puddings made from corn, berries, or wild grains carried meaning and memory. Here, rice pudding stood in as a hollow imitation of comfort, a reminder that even joy came rationed. Today, the cost of feeding dozens on rice, raisins, and sugar syrup might be $13 a week. Affordable, sure, but for those children, it was a bittersweet lesson in what had been taken. 13. Macaroni and cheese casserole. Macaroni and cheese casserole sounded like a feast, but in the boarding schools, it rarely lived up to the name. The macaroni was boiled soft until it clumped together, then baked with blocks of processed government cheese that melted into a sticky, oily layer. The smell was sharp, but the taste was more rubber than rich. Children scraped their forks through the casserole, hoping for a corner piece where the pasta crisped. Most bites, though, were heavy and bland, sitting like a rock in their stomachs. Teachers bragged it was modern food, a sign of progress. But to native kids, it was another reminder of rations replacing tradition. At home, cheese, if it was eaten, came fresh from local farms, or pasta was replaced by wild grains or corn dishes tied to generations of cooking. Here, the casserole felt industrial, not made with care. In today's money, feeding dozens on macaroni and processed cheese would run about $14 a week. Cheap calories, but stripped of comfort. 14. Barley porridge with brown sugar. Barley porridge was another standard on cold mornings. A ladle of thick, grayish mush dropped into bowls, steaming but plain. To make it bearable, a spoonful of brown sugar was sprinkled on top, just enough to tease sweetness, not enough to hide the heavy, grainy texture. Children ate it because they had to. The barley was chewy, sometimes undercooked, sticking to their teeth. The sugar dissolved too quickly, leaving most of the porridge bland and hard to swallow. Teachers insisted it was wholesome, but the kids knew it was just another cheap way to stretch food supplies. Back home, grains might have been cooked with berries, nuts, or even maple sap, turning porridge into something warm and memorable. In the schools, it was stripped of flavor, stripped of love, just another ration. Today, a week's worth of barley and brown sugar might cost under $10. Affordable, yes, but to the children forced to eat it, every spoonful tasted of something missing. 15. Thick vegetable stew with garden potatoes and onions. On good days, the pot held a thick vegetable stew. Potatoes and onions made up most of it, with the occasional carrot or turnip tossed in from the school garden. The broth was cloudy, the vegetables soft and breaking apart, but at least it was warm and filling. Children leaned into bowls of this stew because it carried more substance than the watery soups they usually endured. Still, the flavor was plain. No herbs, no seasoning beyond salt, if there was any at all. It was fuel, not comfort. At home, a vegetable stew could have been alive with flavor. Corn roasted first, wild herbs stirred in, meat bones simmered for depth. In the schools, it became another reminder of what was lost. Fresh food turned into bulk rations. In $25, a week of vegetable stew could be made for about $12. Cheap, yes, but for the children, it was a thin shadow of the meals their families once cooked with care. 16. Day-old bread soaked in sweetened milk. When bread went stale, boarding schools didn't waste it. They soaked it in watered-down milk, added a drizzle of sugar, and called it bread pudding. To hungry children, it looked like dessert. But the first bite told a different story. The bread was soggy, the milk thin, and the sweetness faint, gone after the first spoonful. Kids ate it anyway, because anything with sugar felt like a gift. Some even scraped the bottom of their bowls, hoping for pockets where the syrup pooled. Teachers presented it proudly as a treat, but the children knew it was just leftovers dressed up as pudding. At home, bread pudding, if made, might have been baked golden, filled with spices, or sweetened with berries and cream. Here, it was a reminder that joy could be rationed, and even comfort could taste hollow. In today's terms, a week of this pudding might cost under $8. Cheap survival food, but for the children, it was a bittersweet promise that never truly delivered. 17. Salted fish hash with potatoes. Salted fish hash was one of the harshest meals on the boarding school tables. The fish came in barrels, already dry and tough, its salt content so high it burned the tongue. Chopped into small pieces and fried with diced potatoes, it was meant to stretch a little protein across dozens of plates. The result was a greasy, briny hash that smelled sharp and tasted harsher. Children chewed carefully, picking out bones, washing it down with water whenever they could. Hunger kept them eating, but no one called it good. Teachers insisted it built strength, though most kids left the table thirsty and unsatisfied. Back home, fish might have been smoked over cedar, roasted fresh from the river, or stewed with corn and herbs. In the schools, it was stripped of freshness, packed in salt, and served as punishment food. A week of salted fish and potatoes today would cost maybe $15. Cheap calories? Yes, but each bite was a reminder of how tradition had been boiled down to rations. 18. Chicken neck soup with noodles. Chicken was rare in the schools, but when it showed up, it was usually in the form of chicken neck soup. A big pot of cloudy broth with a few scrawny necks tossed in, barely enough meat to flavor the water. Thin noodles floated through it, soft and overcooked, sticking together in clumps. Children picked at the bones, hoping for even a shred of meat to cling to. Most bowls held nothing more than broth and starch. Teachers called it chicken soup, as if it were comfort food, but to the kids it was little more than flavored water, warm but empty. At home, a chicken might have been roasted whole, shared proudly, or turned into a rich stew with herbs and vegetables. In the schools, even this bird was reduced to scraps, proof that nothing was wasted, except the children's dignity. In $20-25, a week of chicken neck soup with noodles might cost under $12. Affordable, yes, but it left stomachs and spirits just as thin as the broth. 19. Baked hominy casserole with egg and onion. Hominy, once sacred and central in many native kitchens, was transformed into something far different at the boarding schools. Instead of being simmered with care or paired with traditional flavors, it was baked into a heavy casserole. Large pans of hominy were mixed with a few scrambled eggs and bits of onion, then baked until dry and crusted on top. The dish was filling, but bland, eggs and onions too scarce to flavor the bulk of the hominy. Children ate it because it was warm and heavy, though most bites tasted the same, starchy, plain, and lifeless. Teachers praised it as progressive cooking, but to the kids, it was another reminder of how their food traditions were erased. At home, hominy meant family, fire, and ceremony. Here, it became institutional rations. In today's money, a week's worth of baked hominy casserole might cost around $13. Cheap enough to feed dozens, but every bite carried the weight of something sacred turned hollow. 20. Dry biscuits with apple butter. On some mornings, children were given dry biscuits, hard, crumbly rounds that sucked the moisture out of their mouths. To make them seem special, a thin smear of apple butter was spread across the top. Sweet and tart, the apple butter was the only bright spot, but there was never enough to cover more than a bite or two. Kids often licked the apple butter first, saving the sweetness before forcing down the rest of the dry biscuit with water. Teachers pointed to it as a treat, though the children knew it was little more than bulk flour baked into hard bread. At home, biscuits could have been fluffy, eaten warm from the fire, and apple butter thick with spice and care. In the schools, it was ration food, just enough to tease, never enough to satisfy. In 2025 terms, a week of biscuits and apple butter might cost about $10. Cheap to make, yes, but for the kids, the sweetness always disappeared too soon. 21. Creamed dried beef on toast. Creamed dried beef was a breakfast staple in many boarding schools. Thin slices of beef, dried and salty, were chopped into small pieces and mixed with a pale, lumpy white sauce. It was then spread over toasted bread, hard, thick slices that scraped the roof of the mouth. The taste was overwhelmingly salty, the cream sauce barely masking the dryness of the beef. Kids ate quickly, chewing more out of habit than enjoyment, because hunger left little choice. Teachers called it protein-rich and modern, but to the children it was another ration that lacked warmth, care, or flavor. Back home, beef might have been roasted or stewed with vegetables, seasoned with herbs, and shared around the family table. Here, it was reduced to a pale smear over coarse bread, filling the belly but leaving the spirit hungry. In $20-25, a week's supply of creamed dried beef on toast might cost around $12. Cheap, yes, but every bite reminded children that food could feed the stomach while starving the heart. 22. Mashed turnip and potato cakes. Turnips and potatoes, once staples of home kitchens, were mashed together at the schools, formed into flat cakes, and lightly fried in cheap fat. The result was a dense, grayish patty, heavy in the stomach but lacking in flavor. Children chewed carefully, the oily exterior coating their mouths while the inside stuck to their teeth. Teachers praised the cakes as hearty and filling, but for the kids, it was just another reminder that meals here were about quantity, not care. Hunger still gnawed, despite the calorie-heavy cakes. At home, turnips and potatoes might have been roasted with butter or herbs, their sweetness and earthiness enhanced, shared at a table filled with family stories. In the schools, those same vegetables were stripped of dignity, baked and fried for efficiency, not comfort. In today's terms, a week's supply of mashed turnip and potato cakes could cost under $11. Affordable, yes, but every bite left the children tasting not just blandness, but absence, the absence of home, tradition, and warmth. 23. Bean and cabbage chowder with cornbread. Bean and cabbage chowder was served in large, steaming bowls, its gray-green broth filled with overcooked cabbage and soft, mushy beans. The cornbread on the side was dense and heavy, often dry from sitting too long on the tray. Together, they made a filling meal, but flavor was scarce. Children ate quickly, chewing the beans and cabbage while hoping the cornbread would soak up enough broth to make it tolerable. Teachers called it nutritious, but for the kids, it was another lesson in survival. Eat what's given, and be grateful it's warm. At home, beans and cabbage might have been spiced, roasted, or stewed with love, turning humble ingredients into comfort. In the schools, it was stripped bare, fuel for work, not a meal for memory. A week's worth of chowder with cornbread today might cost roughly $13. Affordable and filling, yes, but every spoonful reminded children that even hearty ingredients could be rendered tasteless when love and culture were left off the table. 24. Powdered milk cocoa with hard crackers. Powdered milk cocoa was the closest thing to a treat most children saw in the schools. A thin, lukewarm chocolate drink made from reconstituted powdered milk and cocoa powder, served in metal cups that clinked against the tables. On the side, hard crackers, stale and brittle, meant to scoop up the last drops of cocoa. The drink offered a fleeting sweetness, a brief escape from the monotony of tasteless meals. Kids sipped it slowly, savoring what little comfort it gave. Teachers called it a delightful beverage, but for children used to fresh milk or homemade chocolate drinks at home, it was a reminder of what was missing. At home, cocoa could have been warm, creamy, and shared with laughter. Here, it was functional, thin, and rationed. A week's supply of powdered cocoa and crackers today would cost barely $10. Cheap calories, yes, but the memory of that drink lingered bittersweet, comfort that was always just out of reach. 25. Steamed corn pudding with maple syrup. Corn pudding was often the final sweet note on a school menu. Steamed in large trays, it was dense and slightly sticky, made from ground corn and whatever eggs or milk the kitchen could spare. A drizzle of maple syrup, rare and thin, was added on top, giving a hint of sweetness to an otherwise heavy dish. Children dug in eagerly, savoring the small burst of flavor, but most bites were more about texture than taste. The pudding was filling, yes, but it couldn't erase the monotony of the daily meals or the absence of home-cooked warmth. Teachers called it a treat, but the kids knew it was the same rations dressed up with a touch of sweetness. At home, corn pudding could have been rich, spiced, baked slowly, a centerpiece of family meals. In the schools, it was mass-produced, stripped of care, and served as both nourishment and control. Today, a week's worth of steamed corn pudding with maple syrup might cost around $14. Affordable, yes, but for the children it was a reminder that even sweetness could be rationed, and hope measured in small drizzles. Looking back at these 25 meals, one thing is clear. Food at Native American boarding schools was never just nourishment, it was control. Every bland stew, hard biscuit, or watery porridge tells a story of survival, resilience, and quiet resistance. These dishes stripped away culture, yet the children found ways to hold on, through memory, small acts of defiance, and the occasional stolen taste of something familiar. Today, many of these foods have survived in new forms, sometimes celebrated as heritage dishes or reclaimed recipes in native communities. What was once a tool of oppression has, in some ways, become a symbol of endurance. Each bite reminds us not just of hunger, but of identity, memory, and the strength of those who lived through it.